Well, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for coming. I'm Roger Ream, president of the Fund for American Studies, and it's a pleasure to welcome you to our first lecture this summer in our Capitol Hill Lecture Series. This series is supported by Steve and Nancy Einhorn from Milwaukee and Wisconsin and the Einhorn Family Foundation, and we're grateful for that support. I think this is our 11th year doing this, and it always brings just outstanding people up to Capitol Hill to talk about important subjects. And we're grateful to Senator Rand Paul, who we partner with in planning and executing this lecture series. So thank you all for joining us today. I'm sorry we can't get more chairs set up in this room. So I recommend next time some of you bring your own chairs, but thank you for your willingness to stand. I'm going to ask Senator Rand Paul to introduce our speaker. Senator Paul has championed the cause of our Constitution and fiscally responsible government since he was elected to the Senate in 2010. He is a medical doctor, graduate of Duke Medical School, grew up in Texas, went to Baylor University, and has been representing the state of Kentucky since he was elected to the Senate. He is also passionate about helping people through his Southern Kentucky Lions Eye Clinic, people who can't afford eye surgeries and eye care. He's traveled internationally to provide services to people. Importantly, he's the author of a number of books, The Case Against Socialism, and more recently, Deception, The Great COVID Cover-Up, both authored with his wife, Kelly Paul, who's here today. I had the pleasure of having him on my podcast recently to talk about deception. I recommend the book highly to any of you who want to learn the truth about the COVID issue. At the end of the lecture, I'll say something about our future lectures, but for now, please welcome Senator Rand Paul.
Thank you all for coming. What a great crowd. The mainstream media would have you believe that critics of the government's response to COVID are all part of some vast right-wing conspiracy. But the truth is, our speaker today, Alex Berenson, like Matt Taibbi, who we had last year, Glenn Greenwald, arrived at his perspective really as a lifelong independent, not a partisan on either side. Alex Berenson was born in New York, graduated from Yale University with degrees in history and economics, and worked as a reporter for the Denver Post and the New York Times. His experience at the Times led him to write his first novel, The Faithful Spy. He's written 12 novels. The novel, his first reached #1 on the New York Times bestseller list. During the COVID-19 pandemic, Alex was known for his skepticism of the COVID lockdowns, his questioning of the value of the mRNA vaccines, and his concern with the unholy alliance of big tech, big pharma, and big government, and their threats to your constitutional rights. His most recent nonfiction book, which I read and used as a source for my book, was Pandemia: How Coronavirus Hysteria took over our government, rights, and lives. He explains how the world's overreaction to the virus resulted in economically ruinous lockdowns, the suppression of personal freedoms, and on an unprecedented scale. Alex lives in Hudson Valley with his wife and children. Please welcome Alex Berenson.
Thank you, Senator, for that. Thank you all for coming. You're the last intern class before one side or the other declares martial law this next year, so enjoy it. I could talk about COVID. I'm not going to talk for that long because I think it's great to get questions, and questions are always more interesting than what I have to say. But I do want to talk a little bit about not so much COVID as the First Amendment and how the government decided that it should suppress my rights specifically during COVID because of my views on the mRNA vaccines. When COVID started, I had a few thousand followers on Twitter. I I was probably best known for writing these spy novels, which I'd written a number of, the last in 2018. And then I wrote a book about cannabis, suggesting that cannabis is not a wonderful solution to everybody's problems, but actually a pretty psychiatrically dangerous drug, which got some interest in the media, but actually was pretty roundly denounced by my former friends at places like the Times. So that's where I was at the beginning of 2020. And COVID hit, the lockdowns hit. I pretty rapidly became known as somebody who was questioning the value of countermeasures, whether that be lockdowns, school closures, masks, social distancing. All of it seemed to me to be pretty unsupported by the evidence that we had, and not what we had planned to do when we had discussed potential pandemics. And there was a great line from about 2007. The National Academy of Sciences had a conference to discuss pandemics and to discuss what to do. And there was people were concerned essentially that at the moment of truth, we'd all panic. That we would undertake measures that were not supported in science, essentially out of panic, and that's really what happened. And so I started speaking out on these issues, and I think I was fairly controversial. There were a lot of people who did not like me. Twitter actually came to me and said, "We want you to speak. We think there's a place for robust debate about these issues. We know you're controversial, but we think your voice should be heard." That was in May of 2020. This was under the Trump administration, and so I spoke, and I said some things that I think have held up pretty well. I said a couple things that I wish I could have back. My audience grew. In June of 2020, so in May, I was in contact with Elon Musk a little bit, and in June of 2020, I wrote a booklet called the Unreported Truths booklet. That was I wound up writing a series of these, and Amazon refused to publish it. And I thought to myself, this is bad. Amazon controls a massive amount of the publishing space in the United States and the world. Essentially, anything that's self-published, if you can't distribute it on Kindle, it basically won't exist. And so I actually appealed to people I knew in the media about Amazon's refusal to publish this booklet I'd written, and they mostly ignored me, to my great disappointment. And then I actually contacted Elon, and he tweeted something to the effect of, "This is terrible, and Amazon is a monopoly and should be broken up." And within half an hour, Amazon had told me they were going to publish the booklet, which wound up selling like 250,000 copies and sort of locked me in place as a notable, I would say, COVID countermeasures skeptic. And so that's where I was throughout 2020. And then, like everyone else in this room, I remember waking up to the news that the Pfizer vaccine was incredibly effective. It was the week after the presidential election. There was, the announcement that there was 90% effectiveness. The stock market, the Dow Jones Industrials went up 1,000 points that morning. We all sort of saw this as the end of the epidemic. And I was excited. I mean, I think we were all excited about that. At the New York Times, about 15 years before, I had been a pharmaceutical industry reporter, so I knew that the drug industry didn't always have clean hands. But without too much, I hadn't looked too deeply into the mRNAs or the trials, and so I basically believed the data and believed that this would likely be the end of the pandemic. And then I unfortunately started looking into the details of the trials. And the most important thing you need to understand about the Pfizer clinical trial and the Moderna clinical trial, the clinical trials that got the vaccines approved, is that they enrolled almost nobody at high risk of dying from COVID. So COVID deaths are incredibly age stratified. The people in this room are essentially at zero risk. I'm 51, I'm at very low risk. Really the risk, it increases, geometrically, basically, decade by decade. And the risk is really concentrated in people over 70 and especially over 80. And those people, especially people over 80, had not been enrolled in the COVID clinical trials. I mean, there were 40,000 people in the Pfizer trial, and I believe there were 100 to 200 over 80. I don't want to go, I don't want, it could have been 300. I should go back and check because it is so important, but it was a tiny fraction of people. So once I realized that, I knew that the fix was in, basically, that the companies had done this with the absolute approval of the FDA. They wouldn't have done it otherwise. And so the point was, we want to get this in the arms of people who we know will have an immune response, and we can demonstrate that this vaccine reduces COVID infections, not that it reduces deaths or serious illnesses, because if we wanted to prove that, we would have given it to an entirely different group of people, and we wouldn't have been certain of the results. By doing it this way, we can tell you we have a vaccine that works, and we can end this, which is where a lot of people in government, especially on the left, were after a year of trying to terrify everyone about COVID, even though it wasn't that dangerous to most people. So I saw this, and I started writing about it. And I was not writing that the vaccines caused people to have, to be magnetized or to make quarters stick to their arms. Or I was sticking to the data from the trials, what I saw, and a little bit about side effects as they started to emerge as the vaccines went into people's arms. There were some unexpected side effects, especially around cardiac events and myocarditis. This was in the spring of 2021. I thought that people didn't like me when I wrote about COVID and social distancing and school closures. When I wrote about the vaccines, they really didn't like me. And even people on the right who had sort of supported my anti-lockdown views, a lot of people, I think, just didn't think I knew what I was talking about, or they were willing to get the vaccine because they didn't believe it couldn't work at all based on the clinical trial results. The clinical trial results, I'm not saying they were inaccurate or they were manipulated or anything like that. What I'm saying is they didn't show what everyone thought that they showed because of the population that had received the vaccine. And also, there was only, the trials only lasted a couple months, so we didn't really have any long-term safety data or any long-term efficacy data. And so this is what I was writing in the spring of 2021. And it turned out the White House didn't like it. I know the White House didn't like it because I have records from Twitter showing that the White House asked in April 2021 to have me banned. Now, I think, and I've sued the Biden administration over this. That lawsuit is ongoing. In my opinion, that alone should be enough to win the lawsuit. The White House shouldn't be asking social media companies to ban individuals, period. That should not happen in the United States. We have a constitution. It is not suspended when COVID hits. It is not suspended for the Civil War. It is not suspended because Pfizer doesn't like what I'm writing. It is my right as an American to say what I think. It's actually my right to lie, too, although I don't lie. But it's my right to say whatever I think. Misinformation, disinformation. The government can't go after me. Now, they can prosecute me for fraud if I'm trying to steal money from you through lying. Or if I extort you by saying, if you don't give me money, I'm going to, burn down your house. There are cases when speech is a crime. But that's not what we're talking about. my right to express my opinion, well or badly, with curse words or without, factually accurately or factually incorrectly, that's my right. And the White House didn't respect that. And Twitter, to my amazement, actually told them, we're not comfortable banning him at this time, but we will go back and look and see, what he's done and if it violates our policies. The other social media companies were having conversations with the Biden White House on these issues also. And again, amazingly, it was the companies that said, we're concerned about the First Amendment implications here. The companies were trying to defend our rights against the government, which is pretty stunning, although ultimately they all caved because the pressure got to be too much. And so the Biden administration didn't get what it wanted from Twitter in April, but it didn't stop. And Andy Slavitt, who is his title was a senior advisor to the COVID response team, continued to push, even after he left the White House, Twitter to ban me. And ultimately, in the summer of 2021, as the vaccines started to fail, and this I think was what caught the Biden administration by surprise, although it shouldn't have. It didn't catch the companies by as much surprise, was how quickly the vaccines went bad. Okay, it turns out mRNA vaccines are really good at one thing. They are really good at producing an antibody response in your immune system. Okay, they do what they're supposed to do in that way. They make you make a lot of the spike protein. Your body then responds to that with a lot of antibodies, more antibodies than you would make if you're naturally infected, and not to the entire virus, which is what you would make if you're naturally infected, just to the spike protein. And it turns out that response is not sustainable. After very, very quickly, your antibodies go down, and pretty soon you have no more protection against infection than you would have had you not been vaccinated. We can argue forever whether you have protection against serious infection and death, whether that protection lasts. It's really complicated both immunologically and epidemiologically. I'm not going to go into it right now, but it is incontrovertible that in a matter of months, your protection against infection disappears, okay? And that's what happened in the summer of 2021. What people started to call breakthrough infections just became infections. And that meant two things for the Biden administration. It meant, first, that they were going to have to try to get people to get boosters, which to me, that was a horrendous idea then and now, scientifically, because those hadn't been tested and in any meaningful way. We had given, at least with the initial 2 doses, we'd given a lot of people that. We knew what it meant, at least in the short term. We knew there were no long-term, or we knew there were no serious safety consequences that were visible in those trials. That's all true. We did not know what it would mean to give people a 3rd shot, a 4th shot, a 5th shot. We really still don't. And we also knew at that point that the protection of the 3rd shot couldn't last very long, because you were once again going to get this immune response, and it was once again going to disappear pretty fast. So scientifically and medically, that was a mistake, in my opinion, and should not have happened. But the Biden administration was panicking. And then the other thing that happened in the summer of 2021, Biden had said when he was elected, there will be no mandates. There will be no vaccine passports. And in a matter of weeks in the summer of 2021, the government flipped on that. If Donald Trump had ever made that consequential a reverse on a major policy decision, he would have been raked over the coals for it. This was a big deal, but because it was Joe Biden and because he was doing something about COVID, he was essentially allowed to break his word completely, and nobody even called him on it. So the mandates were terrible. And there's a really simple rule, just like I'm allowed to say what I want as an American and the government shouldn't ban me, okay? Even more central in this country is you're not forced to take medicine as an adult if you don't want to, okay? That's pretty sacrosanct. As a the only exceptions to that in general are psychiatric medicine, and the rules are really strict. 2 psychiatrists have to say that you need it, and then you can go to a judge and fight about it. Okay, we don't make people take medicine, even when we think they're not competent to make the decision. The bar is really high. Okay, the vaccines, they're clearly not vaccines. They don't last very long. They're more like a traditional medicine than a vaccine because, again, a vaccine is something that's supposed to last years, if not your life. This was something that was clearly going to be a matter of months. Otherwise, why would we force people to be boosted? And knowing that, the Biden administration decided to try to force people, adults, to be vaccinated, okay? Essentially by making it impossible for them to work if they did not agree to be vaccinated or be tested essentially on a daily or near daily basis. And in states like New York, it went past that. In states like New York, you were prohibited from going to your workplace. You were prohibited from going to not a grocery store, but restaurants, other places of public accommodation. This, I'm not going to say it was criminal, it was un-American, it was unconstitutional, and it was wrong. Especially, again, at the time this was rolled out, we knew that the vaccines didn't last very long, didn't stop infection, and didn't stop transmission. That means, and by the way, even if they had done those things, it still should have been your personal choice. But the fact that they didn't means there's not even a theoretical justification for this. You're not protecting people who are at high risk if giving it to people who are at low risk doesn't stop them from being infected or transmitting. So there was no justification for any of this. The Biden administration did not care. Joe Biden had sort of come into office saying, I'm going to end this. The vaccines were how he thought he was going to do that. And they were not going to admit defeat on this without a fight. And there were people who were in their way, and I was one of them. And ultimately, they pushed on Twitter until Twitter banned me. And that's what I'm suing the Biden administration for at this time. I'm also suing Pfizer because Scott Gottlieb, who was the head of the FDA and is now a Pfizer board member and is very close with Andy Slavitt, also was pushing Twitter to ban me in the summer of 2021. So it was a true, public-private effort in the best, deep state way. And so now we're 3 years out from this almost. I sued in federal court. I sued Twitter initially in the December of 2021 in a lawsuit that all of legal Twitter, which leans hard left, said had no chance of succeeding. In part, I had to sue in San Francisco in federal court there. Obviously, that's a very blue jurisdiction, but we were lucky enough to get a judge who, although he was a Clinton appointee, really called it down the middle and said Twitter did not really have the right to ban you, even though Section 230 gives it a lot of protection. It promised you that it would follow certain rules before it banned you. It doesn't seem to have followed those, and so your lawsuit can proceed. That led me to be able to get back on before Elon Musk bought Twitter because the lawsuit was very dangerous to Twitter. It was going to be expensive. It was going to potentially pierce this legal shield that they had around 230. They really had no choice but to settle with me, put me back on, and give me some of the discovery that they would have had to give me. In other words, turn over some documents that they would have had to turn over as part of the lawsuit anyway. So I settled with them in the summer of 2022 and very quickly got documents from them showing the role of the White House and of Scott Gottlieb and Pfizer in getting me banned. And so in about a year ago, a little over a year ago, I wound up suing the Biden administration and 2 senior officials at Pfizer. That lawsuit is in New York, and we'll see what happens. It's obviously Missouri v. Biden, which is a bigger social media lawsuit the Supreme Court is about to rule on. That will have some impact on my case. Last week, the Supreme Court made a ruling that was very favorable for me in a case called NRA v. Volo, which is another First Amendment case where New York State essentially leaned very hard on insurance companies and banks to stop doing business with the NRA because it doesn't like the NRA. And this was in the aftermath of the Parkland shootings. And so, again, I can agree or disagree with what the NRA says about assault rifles and guns in general and the Second Amendment, but the government of New York, the state of New York, the government of the United States, the federal government, does not have the right to try to keep the NRA from speaking, or to keep me from speaking, or to keep someone who has a view on climate change from speaking, or if Donald Trump wins, he won't have the right to keep somebody who disagrees with him on immigration from speaking. It's a free country. The First Amendment is the First Amendment. The government needs to respect that. And the saddest thing to me, as somebody who did go to Yale, I grew up in the sort of liberal establishment, is to see people who I respect or I respected not stand up for free speech because they don't like what's being said. Standing up for free speech means standing up for free speech, even if it's not to your taste. And I always try to remember that. And, we can all be hypocrites, but I try not to be on that issue. So thank you all, and I will take as many questions as we have time for.
Just raise your hand and we'll bring a microphone to you, and please identify yourself.
Thank you so much for speaking to us all today. You had touched on this briefly, but I was wondering if you saw a point where free speech was ever dangerous or potentially criminal outside of explicitly threatening somebody or something.
Not really. I mean, look, there's explicit threats. There's if I get together with somebody and make a conspiracy to murder somebody, that's not an explicit threat, but that's not protected, right? If I tell you my company's worth $1 billion and you need to give me 20,000 right now and I'll sell you half, and it's all made up, that's fraud. But here's the thing: we have 200 plus years of figuring this out, and it didn't all go away when the internet was created or when social media came to town. Yes, people have bigger platforms now and things can move more quickly now, but the rules remain the same, and the antidote to speech is always more speech. And when you say to somebody, you can't say that, A, you're denying the people who don't get to hear it the right to hear something that they might want to hear, but B, you're doing something to that person. You're saying, your views are so dangerous, you're so dangerous that you aren't allowed to be part of the body politic, that you're not allowed to be part of society. And when societies do that en masse, it's really bad. Okay? It forces people either to say what they don't think or to sort of slowly go crazy because they question their own view of reality. It's gaslighting on an industrial scale. And so really, I guess I just truly believe that the antidote to speech that I don't like is more speech. And maybe I'm wrong, maybe the internet has changed everything, but I will go down for that principle.
Hello, my name is Noah. I'm an intern at Senator Michaely's office. I've always thought that the media plays a very important role in our society. It's supposed to be a watchdog on the government. It's supposed to keep them in check and keep the people informed. But I mean, in a broad sense, I think it's been so hard to cultivate trust in so many, in the past 20 years even. It's been so hard to cultivate trust in the media because it's polarized, it's so partisan. And then with this censorship of former U.S. presidents, of yourself, during a pandemic where information needs to be shared so that people can stay informed. What does that do to this landscape of media, and how can we restore trust in the media so that we can have that free sharing of information?
It's an excellent question. I think that Donald Trump really did break the media. I think that when he was elected in 2016, when he defeated Hillary Clinton, who everyone in New York thought was going to win, people lost their principles and decided that this couldn't happen again, and if that meant sort of suppressing information, they would do it. Not so much actively lying, okay? It's more about choosing how you report and portray things. And a place like the Times, when I worked there, 1999 through 2010. There was a commitment that we may go hard at somebody, but we're going to let you speak. We're going to let you respond if you want. We're going to try to portray your response accurately, and the readers will have to decide. And so that trust in readers, or viewers, or listeners has disappeared. That's what's disappeared. So you see the Times constantly saying, Donald Trump said falsely. Okay, that wouldn't have happened 20 years ago. They just sort of said, he's saying this, and people can judge for themselves whether or not it's false. Okay, so the media, look, there's a place for loud people on the left, there's a place for loud people on the right, there's a place for Substack, but these big institutions, I do think, and again, especially the Times, because it's what I know best, have lost their way. And I think the Times is trying to course correct a little bit. It's trying to come back a little bit, but it went a long way. And it's sad. Like I read the New York Times every day, and I know there are things I can trust. Like I know their foreign coverage is generally generally nonpartisan. It's generally excellent. But when I'm reading political stories, I have to read it like Pravda. I know the truth is in there, but I have to figure out how they've salted it. And so that's not, and that's the Times, okay? That's not a good place for our media to be. But my answer is not like, oh, the government needs to step in and fix it. No, it will have to fix itself. And hopefully it will do that. If these papers can't fix it, then if CNN can't fix itself, then there'll be more Substacks. There'll be more other voices. That's always my answer, is more speech.
Hi, my name is Ashley Doudney. I'm a student at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. So I'm curious from a national security perspective. Today we're seeing a lot of disinformation with AI and social media. So as we experience this proliferation of AI chatbots spreading disinformation around election security, what measures do you think that our government should take to address that, whether they be incentives in the private sector? What are your thoughts?
Okay, this is an issue, right? AI, deepfakes. That's fraud, essentially, right? That's informational fraud. I certainly don't like the term misinformation. Misinformation is facts on one side that the other side doesn't like, right? Disinformation can be lies, but it can also be strongly presented opinions that one side or the other doesn't like. But deepfakes, whether it's voice, video, that's a problem, okay? And I think it's more a problem for the conduits, in other words, for X or for Facebook to try to get that stuff off. But again, as I said earlier, just because I am close to a free speech absolutist doesn't mean I'm allowed to plan a murder. Just because I don't really believe that misinformation or disinformation are valuable terms means that I think that there should be a deep fake of AI generated pornography of a real person, whatever. Like that stuff is it's outside the bounds of the carriers, so they should try to regulate it. And whether or not it's illegal, some of it may be illegal. As a practical matter, though, I don't think that having the government try to step in and go after individual pieces is, I don't think it's practical, right? I think if there are bad actors out there who are creating, again, whether it's deepfake pornography or something else, you can try to arrest them and punish them. But I don't see beyond that much of a role for government involvement. A lot of questions.
Hi, my name is Colin. I'm interning with Kathy McMorris Rogers' office. And the question that I have for you is, obviously you've gone up against major government, major organizations and companies. Do you have a strategy or philosophy that's helped you go against these people that are quite literally able to censor and able to put up a lot of roadblocks to your speech?
So I will say that, my philosophy is know that you're outgunned and try to use your ammunition as well as you can. So in other words, we could have filed our lawsuit against Twitter in a theoretically more favorable jurisdiction. But Twitter would have pushed to move it to San Francisco, and they would have won. And so I didn't see why I should waste, my time, my lawyer's time, our, limited budget on that fight. My complaint was designed to win, right? It wasn't designed to feed my ego by having 15 paragraphs about what a great reporter I am or whatever. It was about here are the facts you need to know that this is a good complaint. So I mean that's legal tactics, right? But in terms of I guess the bigger question, I believed that I had a good complaint, and I knew that some people would mock it, and I knew I just had to go for it and not be intimidated and hope I got a judge who would hear. And so, I guess my experience with the American legal system has been good, the last couple of years. I'm not sure how many other people can say that, but I trusted. I trusted in my lawyer, I trusted in the law, I trusted in the facts, and so far, so good. Yeah. Go over here.
I'm Evan. I just finished my first year at Yale, and I'm an intern in the House of Representatives. A couple times you mentioned the solution to kind of is to allow more speech. Can you kind of talk about the best way you think that should be facilitated?
I just think that the platforms essentially need to commit to that. Even more than they have. They back off sometimes when they get public pressure or government pressure. Facebook did things during COVID early on. They just pulled pages down. Because they said there were incitements to violence, which was not really true. Here's the thing: if you're one of these platforms, and you're, most of the time they're going to lean ideologically to the left. Okay, I think what the general counsel or the CEO of the platform should say is, if we're going to allow X, and we should allow most things, but if we're going to allow X on a BLM page, we have to allow the same kind of speech on a page that we don't like, where the ideology is not to my taste. And that should be, so when you look sort of philosophically and legally, there's whether or not the government should be pushing the platforms to censor. And to me, the answer to that question is always no, okay? That's easy. The hard question is, there's a law in Texas now that essentially tells the platforms that they can't censor. That's more complicated because that is the government in some ways infringing on the right of the platform to make a decision. But what I would argue is the really big platforms are essentially common carriers, whether that's X, Facebook. There's only 3 or 4 of them, right? Where they're common carriers, meaning they're like AT&T. So AT&T doesn't get ever to block the phone call that you're having with your friend for any reason. Its wires are open to all, or its cellular airwaves are open to all now. Whether or not Twitter, X, Facebook Whether those places are actually common carriers is a really complicated question because they have algorithms that promote stuff, and that's part of their business, right? But I think you can make an argument either way. In the absence of clear law on that, it is up to the platforms to say, we believe in free speech. We are not going to bow down. And again, you do see, it's interesting, when you look at the documents that Jim Jordan's committee released about Facebook and the Biden administration in 2021, it was Facebook pushing back. So they are aware of this. Amazon, same thing. Amazon said, we're aware that we carry books that people don't like. We carry, whether it's the Communist Manifesto or Mein Kampf, we carry stuff people don't like. It's our role as a bookseller to do that. It would be really nice if these companies, again, and we know they lean left, but it would be nice if they just sort of made a declaration of principles that that's how it's going to be. And that might, obviate the need for any government effort to force them to keep the pipes open.
Thank you for the speech and thank you for the opportunity. I'm Caroline from Hungary, and my question may be very European, but I'm interested that are there any limits on free speech in the United States? And I'm asking that because in Hungary, it is considered to be a crime, for example, if you say an untrue fact in the place of public danger, which can cause unrest or confusion among a large group of people. And I don't want to give the impression that any untrue facts were mentioned here. I'm just curious that ideally, is the free speech unlimited in the United States?
So, I mean, there's something called the true threat exemption. So, that's like, if I have a gun and I say I'm going to kill you, like that's a true threat, right? I mean, but it's very, very narrow. It has to be very imminent. Let me give a specific example recently, which is the question of whether or not, the Palestine protests, the Gaza protests, whether universities should have cracked down on those. And my opinion is essentially no. Okay. Now take the edge case on that. The edge case is kill all Jews. Okay. Not from the river to the sea. Like you come out and say it. Kill all Jews. Okay. Even that. I mean, that may be very, very unpleasant. And I'm Jewish, okay? It may be very unpleasant for Jews who are walking around that campus, okay? But if it is not accompanied by an actual threat, I don't know that universities should try to ban that. Now, that doesn't mean that you shouldn't video those people and they have to spend the rest of their lives dealing with the consequences of saying that. It's whether or not, certainly a public university, but even a private university should ban that. And I think it's a very, very hard question, even at the edge case. The reason the universities got in trouble, and this is why this is right, okay? They got in trouble because it's very clear that if you made a similar statement about any other ethnic group, you'd immediately be in trouble. Very serious trouble. You'd be expelled, essentially, immediately. And people knew that very well, okay? And so they got in trouble for hypocrisy and having different sets of rules when the hateful speech was about Jews. And then people, people in Congress said, well, we need to extend the protections. No, maybe you need to think about whether we need any of these protections or whether we should let people humiliate themselves and say terrible things and hope that hearing that doesn't encourage people to want to kill Jews, but makes them think it's a terrible thing to say. So again, like there are very narrow exceptions to sort of free speech in public spaces, but they're really narrow.
Hi, my name is Reagan. I'm really glad that you mentioned speech at universities because my question is kind of about that. I also go to a private liberal university, and so I was wondering what your response is to universities kind of masquerading under the guise of labeling things as hate speech when it comes to people just like expressing their opinion, not really at the expense of others, but just trying to foster and facilitate productive debate, which is not really seen as much on college campuses. I was just wondering what you think.
I mean, I think you can guess what I'm going to say. No, I think it's terrible. I think, and especially at universities, right? Universities should be places for free inquiry and debate. They're places where you should be able to disagree and disagree vehemently without getting in trouble. I mean, again, like to go back to a specific example, these places had policies where if you argued about sort of gender and you dead named somebody, or you misidentified their pronouns, you could be expelled for that, right? I mean, this is crazy. And, this may be offensive to the person, and it may be wrong, but I can't. I mean, how is that an offense worthy of expulsion, right? And so again, this is what got them into trouble with the Gaza protests, right? Because it was very clear that there's one set of rules for almost everybody else, and those rules are not being applied in this case. And so, and what I would hope is that would get people on the left to think a little bit more about freedom of expression and why it's valuable. Unfortunately, like I said, it seems to have done the reverse. It's just going to get Jews thrown in as a protected class, and we're going to have more limits on speech instead of less, fewer.
I'm really struck by the kind of nuanced, moderate tone that you're approaching these very controversial issues. And I'm wondering if you have any reflections on kind of when you're a controversial public figure. I feel like there's a lot of incentives to not have that tone and actually kind of, especially when you're on Twitter, for example, to aim to be very controversial, which is understandable because you do want to spread your like interesting opinions. And I'm wondering if you have any reflections on kind of balancing being a controversial figure, but also kind of making sure to maintain like the admirable tone that you have.
It's funny because most people say my tone on Twitter is not admirable. I mean, I'm lucky. I don't have to run for anything. Like, I don't have to pick one side or the other, and so I can say what I think. I mean, Rand is able to do that. I'm not sure too many people are able to do that. I mean, I think to some extent, and I've tried to cultivate this, there's a real phenomenon in the media on both sides of audience capture. Okay, so in the old days, it was the car dealerships that paid for the newspapers. Okay, it was advertisers. Newspapers were advertising supported almost exclusively, and it turned out that was actually okay because even though you couldn't write bad things about the car dealership or the mall, you could cover the government aggressively. You could cover a lot of things aggressively as long as you didn't write negative things about the car dealership, which was okay. Now all that advertising is gone. It's all gone to Google. It's gone to Craigslist. It's gone to Facebook. It's gone. Newspapers, to the extent they exist at all, are paid for mostly by their readers, and they sort themselves. Okay, the Times, their audience is overwhelmingly liberal, right? Fox News, I mean, that's not directly paid, but they have an audience that's overwhelmingly conservative. And actually, their advertisers tend to run conservative. But to just go back to the papers, because it's a clearer, cleaner example, most papers now, again, to the extent that they're able to survive because of an audience that's very liberal. And they give people that. So my audience on Substack, which is where I earn my living now, is pretty conservative. They came to me from COVID. That's who they are. Not all of them, but a lot of them. And I've decided, I am not going to give in. Because once you start deciding that you can or can't write something because you're afraid it's going to upset your readers, or you have to take a certain stance to make them happy, you can't go back. You become a creature of your audience. And I always want to be able to tell my audience, you know what, I'm going to tell you what I think even if you don't like it. So, but I'm fortunate, and frankly, I have lost some of my audience probably in the last year or two because I've written things about Trump that they don't like. Fortunately, I have a big enough audience and I don't have a big newsroom to run, so I can do that and still do quite well. But it is I'm lucky. And so when you ask me how I'm able to get away with it, I'm able to get away with it because I'm conscious of it and because I'm lucky. That's good. We got a lot of questions. I'll try to answer more quickly. Oh, this is the last one.
Hi, I'm Sawyer from the United States Air Force Academy, interning in the House. You briefly mentioned Section 230. So I know there's some it kind of goes across the aisle when it comes to Section 230. What are your thoughts on what Congress can do and if they should do something, or if executive action, just what are your thoughts on that?
So 230 is really interesting. 230, like as written, actually makes a lot of sense. It's just been terribly misinterpreted by the Ninth Circuit, which is where all these companies are based, to give them massive protection. So what 230 said, Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act, 1996, was passed because the companies, the internet was just taking off, and the idea was there's going to be an enormous amount of information on here. The companies need to have some protection. Just the way if I say something libelous on the telephone, you can't sue AT&T. Okay? If I put up something terrible on X, you can't sue X. X is just a third party. That's totally reasonable. There's too much content. Okay? They can't be held accountable for that. Where it got screwed up was there's a second 230C or 232B section, subsection B, section 2, says they have some ability to censor content. That was very, very clearly intended to protect kids from pornography and other sort of indecency on the internet, okay? And it was supposed to be limited, it was supposed to be in good faith, and that's what it was supposed to be about. But there's like a stray word in there. I think that the language is otherwise objectionable, okay? And the companies, and it's really a fascinating thing to see when you understand how the jurisprudence developed and how the cases developed. They over time convinced the Ninth Circuit, again, and this is where all these cases were heard, and the Supreme Court has never weighed in on this, that 230 that language meant that they could censor too. So they have all the power of a publisher and all the immunity of a phone company. And so they've used it. It's incredibly valuable to them. It means they can basically do whatever they like. I don't know of anybody else in the United States who has been able to force a social media company to let them back on after a 230 ban lawsuit, except me. And again, I had I had some unique facts in my favor. So it's incredibly valuable to them. They know it. By the way, the Biden administration knows it too, which is why in July 2021 they mentioned 230. I think the solution is to go back to the way 230 was meant to be interpreted, which is you can't sue these companies, again, over third-party libelous statements, but they have some responsibility. If they're going to tell you to build your business up on Facebook or to get 1 million followers on Twitter and then become somebody who can leverage that into a business, they can't just be able to take that away from you with no recourse. They can't just silence you, whether you're large or small in this case, with no recourse. And so that's where we should be. How we get back to that, it might take congressional action.
Thank you very much. Thanks for having us.
Oh, wow.
Token of appreciation if you're there.
Oh, yes. neither red nor blue.
That's right.
Well, thank you very much, and thank you for the great questions. If Alex can stay around, I'm sure he'd be happy to answer a few that he didn't get to. Let me just mention that on June 12th, we'll have a second lecture. Our speaker is Vivek Ramaswamy. Unfortunately, we lost this room for that, so we're going to hold it a few blocks from here at the Heritage Foundation Auditorium. It's going to be at 1 p.m. June 12th. You'll all be invited. And registration for it opens up at, it just opened. Right now, you can register now for the lecture on June 12th. Seating's a little more limited, so please join us then. On behalf of the Fund for American Studies and Senator Paul, thank you so much for coming. One more round of applause for Alex Berenson. Okay.